from 5% to 10%, and you refused to negotiate lower than a 9 or 10% margin, what would happen to your business? Or, put it this way, how much of your business would you lose? And most people said something like 30 to 40% of their business would be out the door. Now think about that. You're doubling your margins, and you're losing 30 or 40% of your business. You'd be better off doubling your margins. Now that might not be the case here, but you have to ask yourself, what if we raised our margins by 10, 20, 30, 40, 50%? Are we really at the optimal level, or are we always being pushed down to the lowest common denominator because we find ourselves in auctions with the same players each time and we're setting a lower standard? All right, it's worth considering in your particular industry. Okay, let's change the topic a little bit. I'm going to tell you another story, which is about winning in a situation where you're weak because you're weak. All right, let me explain what this is all about. I'm going to explain this in the context of another political example. Again, I like going back to the early 1900s. When Amartya Sen was here yesterday, in his talk, he kept going back to the 1800s. I am not quite as old as Professor Sen, so I will go to the early 1900s. And this is 1919, and for history buffs, 1919 is when World War I, what was known as the Great War at the time, had ended. And in Paris, there was lots of peace negotiations going on, and there were negotiations sort of in name, because most of the decisions were being made by the Allied forces, you know, the United States, Great Britain, and France primarily. And they would hold these sessions with all these other countries and all these delegations, and then they would decide what to do going forward. And the biggest decisions they were making were about geographic boundaries. And they made a lot of decisions that caused a lot of wars later on, but at the time they were trying to do the best they could, and they were redrawing geographic boundaries in the Middle East and in Europe. And typically what would happen in these negotiations is that people that had supported the Allied cause would get a better deal. They would find their geographic boundaries expanding. And people that had been on the other side or had not been involved weren't given that reward. So this is an age-old story, but Romania ends up being a bit of an exception to this rule. Romania provided little, if any, help to the Allied cause during World War I. But at the end of it, during the negotiations, they saw the size of Romania almost double. I mean, they got huge kickback out of this negotiation. And the question is, why? They weren't a superpower by any stretch of the imagination. They were actually quite weak. And they hadn't really contributed much to the Allied cause, so they didn't really have much of an argument to make. Or did they? It turns out that the reason they got what they wanted was because they were really, really weak. And what I mean by that is the following. In 1919, after Germany had been defeated and the other Axis countries had been defeated, the biggest threat to the West was no longer a resurgent Germany. The biggest threat to the West was the result of the October Revolution in Russia, which had created Bolshevism, or communism. And the biggest threat to the West was the spread of communism. And Romania walked in and said, listen, we're weak, we're pathetic, we're nobodies. But we're right next to Russia. And if we remain too weak, we're going to get run over by Russia, and we'll become communists. And then you're really screwed. Because now, communism is at your doorstep. And the Allied forces said, well, that's true. And we can't let you be that weak. We're going to have to give you what you need to make sure you're strong enough that you're so weak that if somebody pushes you too hard, you're going to die. And that would be bad for us. And again, I'm going to draw a parallel between that and what can happen in the business world. So here's a situation about a dispute between a manufacturer and a distributor of computer equipment that took place about 15, 20 years ago. And the arrangement was very simple. This US manufacturer was going to build these computers, and the South American distributor was going to distribute them in certain countries in South America. And they had a minimum purchase agreement, and everything was fine. And then a year and a half later, they end up at the mediator's table because they're going to go into court to litigate because things have fallen apart. And the question is, what went wrong? And they both have their side of the story. And the South American distributor, which is a very, very small player in this negotiation, argues that as soon as we had been given this model to distribute in South America, this US manufacturer came out with a new model and refused to allow us access to distribute the new model. What they were really doing was dumping the old model in South America. And by not giving us access to the more improved model, we're stuck with a crappy model that's not going to sell. In fact, the manufacturer then went on to terminate the agreement illegally. So what we want is about $8 million, comprised of loss of reputation, loss of profits, and money invested in setting up the distribution channels. All right, because we were actually the victim of fraud, I think is the language that they used. All right, they were fraudulent in their negotiations, and we're stuck. The U.S. manufacturer, a big company that some of you would have heard about if I named it, or everybody would have heard about if I named it, said, actually, you have this all wrong. In fact, the distributor never even ordered the minimum purchase agreement amount in year one, and we let that slide. Now, the question is, what was the final agreement? Because they were able to mediate an agreement before going to court, instead of going to court. And here's what they came up with. The U.S. manufacturer will pay $1 million to the distributor. The manufacturer will give the distributor exclusive right to sell the new product and future products in a few key regions of South America. Why would this happen, right? Now, if I was to spend an hour and a half on this case like I do when I teach this case, we could get into the nitty-gritty, but it turns out that the argument made by the distributor, at least implicitly, was the same argument made by Romania. And the argument was this: yeah, we're weak. All right? And fine, we didn't have distribution channels set up before, but we do have them set up now. And if you push us hard, if you don't give us any money, we're going to collapse because we have no money and we have no good product to sell. And if we collapse, of course, we're going to go bankrupt. And we're done. So we can't fight you. But think about what happens to you if we no longer exist. It'll take you at least a few years to find another distributor who can take your product to market in these 3 or 4 countries. And the U.S. manufacturer gave them $1 million, not because they felt that they'd done anything wrong, but because the $1 million was needed by the distributor to stay alive. And in the following year, they got that money back, and much more in the years ahead, because they were able to structure this deal. And the argument was essentially this: we're weak. If you punch us too hard, we'll die, and then you will lose a value-creating partner. All right? So weakness can be a strength. They might need for you to survive and to be successful. The key insight, of course, here is that your power is not simply based on the strength of your alternatives. More fundamentally, this is a point that we've started from the very beginning, your power is determined in large part by your ability to create value for your clients or for the other side. And that's what you need to recognize. How can I increase the ways in which I am of use to them? What are all the things? You know, people walk into negotiation often with this mindset of, well, you know, I want to get this kind of price, and I want to get this, and I want to get this, and I want them to throw in this concession. And that's the wrong mentality. The right mentality in negotiation is to go in and learn as much as you can about their needs, their interests, their concerns, their fear, their perspective. Because the more you know about what makes their life better, the more ways you have of potentially creating value for them, and the more ways you have of potentially getting some of that value for yourself by monetizing it. I'll give you another example of a small firm in the pharmaceutical industry. This is a student of mine who was a very small player negotiating with a large pharmaceutical firm. You would know about the large pharmaceutical firm, not about this small player. After the deal was done, so they negotiated some deal, he decides to squeeze them for more money. All right? The gall of this person. And he sends me an email a little while later, and it says something like this. Oh, it says exactly this. I'd agreed to sell the rights to 8 different drugs I have in development. I had negotiated for 5 straight days on this deal, and it closed before the Harvard course. After your classes, I called up the pharmaceutical company that is buying the rights and said that I needed more money up front. The company was taken aback by my call. Not surprising.